I'm sorry that for some of you, this is the second time I've inflicted myself on you, having this morning given a more general presentation in the opening of the conference. But the theme for me this afternoon is indeed Fethullah Gülen and the art of coexistence in an age of global oppositions. Fethullah Gülen has observed that modern means of communication and transportation have transformed the world into a large global village. So those who expect that any radical changes in a country will be determined by that country alone and remain limited to it are unaware of current realities. This time, he says, is a period of interactive relations. So while some oppositions and contradictions are particular to our own individual societies, there are others that we might call global oppositions that run deeply and profoundly between and across all societies. These global oppositions include those between the religious and the secular, and the related but distinct ones of science and religion. They also include the West and the East, and the related but distinct ones between Christianity and Islam. Of course, not all oppositions are as oppositional or contradictory as they might at first sight appear. And the tension that derives from oppositions is not always something to avoid. Not all conflict is bad. Sometimes it's only through what the German language calls a Spannungsfeld, or a field of tension, created by oppositions, that historical developments occur. But a lot depends on how oppositions are approached and handled. And it is in relation to such an art of coexistence that this paper argues the contemporary Turkish Muslim scholar Fethullah Gülen has much to offer. First of all, the global oppositions between the religious and the secular. They have roots that go back at least into the European Enlightenment. And today, those oppositions are one of the major frames for many of the issues that we face in our individual societies. In the history of Albania, the country in which we're meeting, there was a period, not so very long ago, during which the secular of a particular ideological form exerted enormous pressure on religions and their institutional forms, to the extent that in 1967 the claim was made of Albania being the world's first atheist state. And the life, work and teaching of Fethullah Gülen was also forged in a context where strong oppositions existed between the religious and the secular, in the 20th century story of Turkey. However, while properly traditional, the vision of Islam set out by Fethullah Gülen is one that distinguishes itself both from a narrow kind of secularism and also obscurantist and oppositionalist forms of Islam. As summarized by Sahin Alpay, on the one hand, he said, Haj Effendi opposes the use of Islam as a political ideology, as well as polarizing society into believers and non-believers. And on the other hand, as Mr. Gülen himself has put it, quotes, secularism should not be an obstacle to religious devoutness, nor should devoutness constitute a danger to secularism. Thus, Fethullah Gülen distinguishes an approach to the secular that promotes the participation of citizens of all religions and none in the public life of a society, and distinguishes that from an ideological form of secularism that promotes positivist philosophical positions and their political consequences. Secondly, the global oppositions between science and religion. In his reflections on what are the still relatively recent human attempts to build societies without reference to spiritual values, Fethullah Gülen explains this, quotes, Enlightenment movements that began in the 18th century saw human beings as consisting of the mind only. Following that, positivist and materialist movements saw humans as solely material or corporeal entities. He refers to, quotes, a scientific materialism, a view of life and the world that had severed itself from religion, and which, because of its perspective that nature is an accumulation of things that has no value outside its ability to meet physical needs, has, as a consequence, brought great dangers to our planet. By contrast, Mr. Gülen speaks of nature as having a certain sacredness, an arena in which God's beautiful names are displayed. He reflects human creatures are composed not only of body and mind, of feelings and a spirit, rather we are harmonious compositions of all these elements. Therefore, Mr. Gülen's perspectives and the movement's educational initiatives and institutions strongly affirm that Islam and education, science and technology should not be seen as being in conflict. Rather, Mr. Gülen argues as follows: in its true meaning, religion does not oppose or limit science and scientific work. He sees religion and science as different worlds' ways of expressing the same meaning, content, and truth. Quotes, the universe as a mighty Quran deriving from God's attributes of power and will. In other words, if the term is proper, the universe is a large, created Quran, in return being an expression of the universe's laws in different forms. The Quran is a universe that has been coded and put on paper. And then there are the global oppositions between East and West. It's often the case that those oppositions and the oppositions between religion and secular, religion and the scientific are linked with oppositions between West and East. But arguably, the global oppositions between West and East are probably as much as a result of the history of colonialism and imperialism, words that in many ways are out of fashion in the contemporary world, but which do describe historical realities of immense significance for contemporary life. As Mr. Gülen observed, Islamic societies, he said, entered the 20th century as a world of the oppressed, the wronged, and the colonized. The first half of the century was occupied with wars of liberation and independence, wars that carried over from the 19th century. In all these wars, Islam assumed the role of an important factor, uniting people and spurring them to action. Against what was seen as invaders, Islam, national independence and liberation came to mean the same thing. Mr. Gülen is certainly not apologetic about the achievements of Muslim civilizations, and in particular highlights the religiously informed realism of the Ottoman rulers in dealing with cultural and religious diversity in their empire. But while recognizing those achievements of the Ottoman past, Fethullah Gülen has argued strongly that Muslims should not seek to retreat from modernity into dreams of past glories. And one of the ways in which the oppositions of West and East have become focused is in our European setting and around our European setting in relation to identity and membership of the European Union. Albania, as a country with a majority of Muslims, has applied to join the EU, while Turkey has for a long time had a special relationship with it, which it hopes might ultimately lead to full accession. In a 2006 piece entitled "With Accession, Europe Would Know Us Better," Gülen says, "I have been in favour of EU membership for a long time." And that's particularly significant given that historically in Turkey, it was generally the Kemalists who understood themselves as both modern and Western, while significant numbers of religious Turks were concerned that Europe is, quotes, a Christian club. But in contrast to such a class of civilizations, bloc thinking, Gülen has argued as follows: a Turkey in the EU will more successfully realize its function to establish a bridge between the Islamic world and the West. And coming now to the fourth and final of the global oppositions that I've identified between Christianity and Islam. Because of their historic alignment with dominant civilizational streams, Christianity and Islam have often formed part of the discourse of oppositions between West and East. For example, before he was elected as Pope Benedict XVI, the then Cardinal Josef Ratzinger in 2004 wrote to European bishops explaining why he found the notion of Turkey joining the European difficult. He said the following: "The roots that have formed Europe, that have permitted the formation of this continent, are those of Christianity. Turkey has always represented another continent in permanent contrast with Europe. There were the old Ottoman Empire wars against the Byzantine Empire, the fall of Constantinople, the Balkan Wars, the threats against Vienna and Austria. It would, he said, be an error to equate the two continents. Turkey, he said, is founded upon Islam. Thus, the entry of Turkey into the EU would be anti-historical." Such sentiments do have their equal and opposite mirror among a number of Muslim spokespeople. But it is, of course, very important to distinguish between the oppositions of West and East, Christianity and Islam, not least because some of the most ancient of Christian communities are to be found in lands where Islam predominates today. Thus, Iraq has been home to some of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world, while in recent times we have been reminded that Coptic Christians are an integral part of Egyptian history and society. Similarly, Muslims in Europe have not only been a phenomenon of recent migration and refugee movements of people. Rather, Islam has been long established in Europe, both in Spain and here in the Balkans, as well as having a long history in countries such as Poland, where, for example, a Tatar Muslim population has a long, though generally less recognized, history. But because bloc thinking about religions, in a similar way in which it used to be about political oppositions in the Cold War, can be found among both Christians and Muslims, Fethullah Gülen's commitment to Muslim, Christian and other forms of dialogue is of great importance. It was set out perhaps most clearly in his article on the necessity of interfaith dialogue, a Muslim perspective, published before 9/11. And maybe the most comprehensive collection of his thinking about dialogue was developed in his book, which is on the tables outside, Towards a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance. In his Reflections for the Millennium, published in that book, Mr. Gülen set his conviction about the importance of dialogue in the following ways. "I believe and hope that the world of the new millennium will be a happier, more just and more compassionate place, contrary to the fears of some people. Islam, Christianity and Judaism all come from the same root, have almost the same essentials, and are nourished from the same source. Although they've lived as rival religions for centuries, the common points between them and their shared responsibility to build a happy world for all the creatures of God make interfaith dialogue among them necessary. This dialogue has now expanded, as our chair reminded us, to include the religions of Asia and other areas. The results have been positive. This dialogue will develop as a necessary process, and followers of all religion will find ways to come closer together and assist each other." In closing then, it's the argument of this paper that such teaching of Fethullah Gülen and the actions inspired by the movement of volunteers can contribute positively to the development among global oppositions, these oppositions between religious and secular, religious and scientific, West and East, Christianity and Islam, something of the art of coexistence. And I use the word coexistence carefully because 20 years ago, yes, I'm getting older, I was very often involved in East-West relations among ordinary people and through religious communities, keeping conversations going when political conversations did not exist. And there was a song at the time in the UK, "The Russians loved their children too." And I like to say today, to those who find it hard to hear, the Muslims loved their children too. And coexistence in those days sometimes was an excuse for not engaging with each other, for not interfering with each other, for not holding one another to common standards. But I would like to emphasize that the art of coexistence that one finds in the teaching of Fethullah Gülen has an emphasis on the word co in a positive way. Not live and let live only, but our shared responsibility for what we create together. And I use the word art to describe that, since human affairs are not capable of being dealt with according to scientific paradigms, but rather practical wisdom. Thus, as Mr. Gülen himself puts it, in the world in which we live, people with different ideas and thoughts are either going to seek ways of getting along by means of reconciliation, or they will constantly fight with one another. There have always been people who thought differently to one another, and there always will be. So finally, Muslims and others have no choice but to live alongside one another in Europe. The only question facing us all is about the way in which we currently do this and how we shall do so in the future. It's the argument of this paper that the thinking of Mr. Gülen and the practical initiatives of the community inspired by him and his teaching offers resources that engage with the secular and the scientific and are ready for dialogue with Christians, with people of other faiths, and with people of no faith, and that these resources contribute to that art of coexistence possibility because they are confident of what Islam can offer, and yet they're also prepared to work within the current realities of a situation for Muslims and Islam in Europe, rather than seeking to promote idealized visions which retreat into the past or have no connection with a diverse and shared future. Thank you.